Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dan Torello, and I manage the chair programs here at the Kluge Center, and it's my great privilege to welcome you to the Library of Congress this afternoon for our program. One of the wonderful traditions at the Kluge Center is that in addition to scholars from all over the world, every year we have the chance to appoint a staff fellow who is from the Library of Congress. And today it's my honor to introduce Dr. Jurretta Jordan Heckscher. She was the staff fellow in 2023 and 2024. And Jurretta came to the Kluge Center from her role as reference specialist for the early American history in the main reading room, and where she worked for close to a decade, and we're so glad to see many of your colleagues here today, so welcome. Jurretta's biography is rich in experience. She grew up in the Philadelphia area where she trained for a professional career in ballet. She has degrees from Harvard University in comparative literature, from Oxford University where she was a Marshall Scholar, and a PhD from the George Washington University where she was awarded the Ralph Henry Gabriel Prize for Best Dissertation in American Studies. And I might also add that if you go online, you'll still find many of Jurretta's pieces from when she was writing for the Harvard Crimson. I checked them out today. They're super cool, so go have a look. Jurretta's talk today is titled Almost a Nation of Dancers, Black Dancing, Culture, and Identity in the Greater Chesapeake, 1700 to 1865. So thank you so much for being with us, and please give Jurretta a warm welcome.
Thank you all. Can everyone hear me properly? Okay. I want to speak with you today about the nature and cultural significance of the Black dance tradition that developed in what can best be described as the Greater Chesapeake region: Virginia, Maryland, the District of Columbia, Southern Delaware, and the northern portion of North Carolina. It developed between approximately 1700 and 1865 in this area. This is a topic that I have long studied, and I'm deeply grateful that my Kluge Staff Fellowship 2 years ago gave me the opportunity to give it my sustained attention for the first time in a number of years through the peerless resources of the Library of Congress. Returning to my research at a time when the study of American slavery and its legacies is as dynamic as any field of historical inquiry was both daunting and exhilarating, and I continue to supply my deficit of current knowledge in such essential areas as the problem of ethnic continuity between African and American regions and the impact of evangelical Christianity on Black dance. I'm not going to go into any more depth on those areas, but I'd be happy to discuss them if you have questions in the question period. And I should say there's several other areas that are particularly dynamic at this time, particular subjects or subfields of the study of New World slavery that are relevant to my work as well. It remains my contention that this artistic tradition of the Greater Chesapeake is enormously significant, both as an astonishing work of collective creativity and as a generative cultural legacy that has come to affect humanity far beyond its original scope. What I can offer you today is some of the evidence and interpretation supporting that conclusion, which I will further elaborate in book form at some point. Sooner rather than later, I hope, and my husband undoubtedly prays at this point. I approach the topic as an admirer and derivative practitioner of this art form, not as someone who belongs to its primary community of creators, which is just a fancy way of saying, this is a Black art form, and I am obviously a white person. As such, oversights and misunderstandings on my part are inevitable. If you notice any in the course of this talk, I'd be truly grateful if you'd let me know. And I'd be happy to give you my contact information if you want to reach me at a later time. Ultimately, I'm writing the book from which this talk derives, not because no one else could do it better, but because no one else has done it at all. And whatever its imperfections, this talk, like the book to come, is offered in tribute to the dancers. Why then should we study the Black dance tradition of the 18th and 19th century Greater Chesapeake? Why is it important to understand it? I can best begin to answer those questions with a story. It is the year 1829 in Queen Anne's County on Maryland's eastern shore. A 16-year-old boy, an African American and a slave, is, in his words, very fond of dancing. So he has decided to go to a dance, even though it is to be held late at night, miles away from his home plantation, and he does not have permission from his master to go dancing that night at all. He manages to acquire some nice clothes for the occasion, and at about 10 o'clock, he steals into the barn and helps himself to one of his master's horses to ride through the dark to the dance. He knows that he must have the horse back in the barn, looking fresh and clean again by morning, and he knows with certainty that if he fails to do so, he will be whipped. At first, the dance is all that he had hoped, but it ends wretchedly for him, and when he makes his way home, worse awaits. As he recalled, quote, "Now when I got home, the stable was in a very bad situation, and I was afraid to bring my horse in until I could strike a light. When this was done, I took the saddle and bridle off outside. No sooner had I done this than my horse reared over the bars and ran away into the meadow. I chased him till daylight, and for my life I could not catch him. My feelings now may be better imagined than described. When the reader remembers that this horse, with all the rest, master had seen clean at 6 o'clock the night before, and all safe in the stable, and now to see him in the meadow with all the marks of having been driven somewhere and by somebody, what excuse could I make, or what story could I invent in order to save my poor back from that awful flogging, which I knew must be the result of the revelation of the truth?" Desperate, he decides to fool his master by turning all the other horses out into the meadow also, and casting suspicion on another enslaved man whom he dislikes. The ruse succeeds, and the other man receives a beating instead. Others who had been with him at the dance were not so lucky. When it was time for them to go home, they discovered that the horses they had used had gotten loose and run away. As the young man recalled, quote, "When they discovered that their horses were gone, there was the greatest consternation among them. The forebodings of the awful consequences if they dared to go home induced many that night to seek salvation in the direction and guidance of the North Star. Several who started off on that memorable night I have since shook hands with in Canada. They told me there were 16 of them went off together. 4 of them were shot or killed by the bloodhounds, and 1 was captured while asleep in a barn. The rest of those who were at the dance either went home and took their floggings or strayed into the woods until starved out and then surrendered." Think about that for a moment. This autobiographical story, which jibes with a large body of additional evidence, confirms the extraordinary risks that some African Americans enslaved in the Greater Chesapeake were prepared to take in order to dance. Dancing was worth the risk of excruciating physical punishment. It could be worth the risk of consequences so dire that one might feel compelled to flee one's family and community in a desperate gamble for escape to the North. Ultimately, dancing was even worth the risk of death. So if we ask why we should study this tradition, the answer is because it mattered enormously to those who created it. At the heart of my research is the quest to understand the reasons for its importance. For if we can explain those, we will understand something deeply important about the values that sustained their lives. At the simplest level, it might be said that dance mattered greatly to those enslaved in the Americas because dance mattered greatly to their forebears in Africa. Quote, "We are almost a nation of dancers," Olaude Equiano said of his ancestral Igbo culture, reflecting what was surely firsthand knowledge for his elders, if not for himself. And, quote, "Every great event, such as a triumphant return from battle or other cause of public rejoicing, is celebrated in public dances," end quote. Indeed, the presence and importance of dancing in many of the source cultures affected by the transatlantic slave trade was apparent even to the ignorant and largely unsympathetic eyes of the Europeans who dominated the production of such 17th and 18th century records as have survived. What emerges even from these fleeting and flawed accounts is unmistakable evidence that cultures in widely separated regions of Africa shared broad common preferences in the social organization of their dance practices, including the presentation of gender, similar habits in the spatial and dynamic dispositions of the body, and generative temporal structures that made rhythmic virtuosity the engine of bodily movement, and bodily movement a visual dimension of musical form. Given their geographic breadth, these norms were probably ancient. Certainly, they seem to have been so widespread and persistent that they continue to shape much traditional African dance today. Such evidence confirms the conclusion that Melville Herskovits drew more than 7 decades ago to explain the African cultural continuities in the New World. He argued for the presence of a grammar of culture shared across much of West and Central Africa, a common set of deep structural principles that link specific forms of cultural expression across different ethnic groups and explain their underlying similarities. Like the grammar that orders a language, these principles seem to have provided enslaved people from many African nations with a common foundation on which to order the values, assumptions, and orientations of the diverse creolized African American cultural systems that they fashioned in the Americas, including expressive gesture and the closely related domain we call dance. Out of such African commonalities, perhaps not long before the 18th century had become the 19th, Black people in the greater Chesapeake built something like a regional Chesapeake tradition, something that the African Americans who were by then the dancers recognized as their parents' way of dancing and therefore their own. The result was a thing entirely novel in European and European American eyes. In Maryland in 1774, a young Englishman struggled to find words for the Negro ball he witnessed. Quote, "Their dancing is most violent exercise, but so irregular and grotesque, I am not able to describe it." Close quote. A decade later, a Virginia traveler noted that each participant at an all-night Negro dance typically, quote, "performs with astonishing agility and the most vigorous exertions, keeping time and cadence most exactly until he exhausts himself," close quote. Such fragmentary evidence, almost entirely filtered through uncomprehending white eyes, nevertheless suggests the basic qualities of 18th century Black dance: angularity and asymmetry, rhythmic precision, long duration, physical virtuosity, and dynamic intensity. What was wrought by Africans and their children in the early Chesapeake, then, like the kindred dance traditions created simultaneously by other peoples of African descent throughout the Americas, was a primary creolization that undergirds much of the subsequent development of American vernacular dance, the creating of a new choreographic tradition out of disparate African ancestral lineages. It was the first of several creolizing processes that have shaped much of the nation's, that is the United States, vernacular dance heritage. And because it arose from conditions unique to the Western Hemisphere, it was surely, in the broadest sense, among the first distinctively American forms of art. The historical record leaves no doubt that 19th century Black dancing continued to be rooted in an African movement grammar. Even some of the elements that mirrored European practices likely represented continuations or revivifications of African movement preferences rather than the adoption of white norms. Thus, if, as the limited pictorial record suggests, the typical African practice of bending the torso emphatically at the waist and hips gave way by the 19th century to a general preference for a straighter and more upright spine, such verticality may well have been less a European-influenced innovation than a development of the African movement preference for the strong, balancing spine that enabled enslaved women in the greater Chesapeake to carry heavy loads on their heads like their African foremothers, a capacity which white women in the region did not share. Other formative elements of the 19th century Chesapeake tradition were unmistakably African and most probably continued 18th century practices. They included a strong preference for angular and asymmetrical dispositions of the body, enabling the dancer to emphasize the independence of different body parts and thereby serve the articulation of simultaneous multiple body rhythms, polyrhythms, that is, in the African mode. The carriage of the body's center of gravity low in the hips and pelvis, rather than high in the abdomen and solar plexus, as in European classical dance, a practice that loosened the waist to mediate contrasting rhythmic impulses in the upper and lower torso. The extensive use of certain spatial formations with clear African antecedents, such as a ring encircling a soloist or the, quote, apart dancing, unquote, of two dancers paired without touching as they relate playfully to each other and to the same rhythmic flow. Abundant scope for competitive individuality and improvisation, and a dynamic intensity and inventive range, embracing movements, quote, of every imaginable description, close quote, from lavish, quote, contortions, flings, kicks, gyrations, close quote, and leaps, to exquisitely subtle articulations of the muscles of the face. In its seamless integration with music, too, this tradition, like so many others from African wellsprings, made music and dance a single whole, perhaps most obviously in the rhythmic slapping of the body known as patting juba, which was both a form of music and a form of dance, and may have been other kinds of dancing's most frequent accompaniment. The core of the Afro-Chesapeake dance music complex, for so it should be designated, the two were complementary aspects of a single art form, really. The core of the Afro-Chesapeake dance music complex was virtuosic rhythmic exactitude, rhythm's emphatic articulation in the motions of the body and the sounds of the feet, whose intricate diversity of motion, from smooth shuffles to percussive toe and heelings, already manifested the range that came to characterize the jazz tap tradition. The visual uniformity of European-derived dance was unnecessary, for with, quote, everyone moving after his or her own fashion, but keeping time to the beat, close quote, as one white observer described it, rhythm itself was the unifying force field, even amid the individualities of improvisation. By shaping each movement with the vital beat, Black dancers in the Chesapeake carried forward a fundamentally African contribution to American vernacular dance. In so doing, they made what all evidence suggests was a conscious choice to continue a powerful link with the dancing of their ancestors. Surely, that was one of the reasons why they found deep meaning in dancing itself. Yet within a generation or two of establishing a distinctive regional dance culture in the 18th century, and possibly almost simultaneously with that achievement, enslaved people in the greater Chesapeake began to reach beyond the dance grammar inherited from their African ancestors to incorporate elements of their oppressors' dancing. In so doing, they launched the second great creolization that shaped a continental North American dance identity, gradually fashioning a mature and immensely influential African American tradition that reached its zenith between approximately 1800 and 1865. This development depended on one of the defining characteristics that differentiated the African American experience in the greater Chesapeake from those in the other early North American areas founded on slavery, Louisiana and the South Carolina Lowcountry. The constant contact between enslaved people and their enslavers that arose inevitably in a region characterized more by small farms than by large plantations, although the latter, of course, existed also. In fact, in no other North American slave society was Black-white interaction as early, as thorough, and as habitual as in the greater Chesapeake. Here, Black people were likely to live in close proximity to their captors, to interact with them routinely and frequently, and to be constantly aware of their social practices, including a zeal for dancing that matched their own. At the same time, there is no evidence that the oppressors attempted to force white dance practices on those they held in bondage. On the contrary, the surviving records strongly suggest that such integrations were a choice made by the dancers themselves, and may therefore shed further light on what their dancing meant to them. Momentous shifts in human culture can sometimes be marked in small things. Something as slight as the shift to dancing frequently on the balls of the feet may have indexed the grafting of European elements onto an African dance heritage, for no such footwork surfaces in the scant records remaining of African dancing in the 17th and 18th centuries, nor is it characteristic of traditional dance today in areas of Africa from which most Chesapeake slaves came. Yet the historical evidence in both words and images documents its prevalence in the greater Chesapeake of the 19th century. Like the use of upright posture, therefore, elevated footwork may have been adopted from white dance norms. What is indisputable is that other elements fundamental to the antebellum black dance tradition were indeed adopted from white practices. A range of dance forms that became standard at black dance events, including solo jigs and hornpipes, and couple dances such as reels, waltzes, and the broad genres identified simply as country dances and square dances, and male-female partnering, in which the partners often touched. The most significant of these incorporations, both because it represented a fundamental break with African traditions and because the incorporation of white set dance forms depended on it, was the practice of heterosexual partnering, the adoption of the male-female dyad as the normative, though certainly never the exclusive, structural unit of dance. First manifest in the mid-18th century, and earlier in several other slave societies in the Americas, such partnering had clearly become a standard practice in the greater Chesapeake by the late 1820s. It is difficult for us to imagine what a radical departure from African tradition this innovation appears to have been. Though men and women sometimes danced together in parallel group formations, in all the vast riches of the sub-Saharan African dance heritage, there seems to be, and I stress that this is provisional, no evidence for sustained one-on-one male-female partner dancing anywhere before the late colonial era. And even then, it was apparently often regarded as a European peculiarity in distinctly poor taste. Why might black dancers in the Chesapeake have chosen to depart so radically from their ancestral heritage? Perhaps because their dance events were what the anthropologist Victor Turner called, quote, dominant genres of cultural performance, close quote, enabling those who danced or witnessed dancing to imagine and reimagine certain vital dimensions of a shared identity in vividly important ways. It seems highly probable that the incorporation of couple dancing provided both a means of acknowledging and reimagining the provocative presence of European dance forms in the new American milieu, and a means of negotiating and expressing perhaps the greatest change in social ideals that marked the transition from Africa to America. That is, the passage from a polygynous to a monogamous paradigm of marriage that took place at roughly the same time as the black adoption of couple dance. Consider that the great majority of historical sub-Saharan African societies seem to have held to a polygynous ideal, one that not all could achieve, but to which all might aspire. Yet in the greater Chesapeake, as throughout the South, for reasons that historians have only partially unraveled and that surely bore some unfathomably complex relation to the white example, the monogamy initially enforced by sexual imbalances in the enslaved community quickly became neither a demographic necessity nor the white man's imposition, but an inherently black ideal. It is my belief that centrally coupled choreographies may well have offered a concrete way of imaging and playfully honoring those bonds of monogamous love that came often to be forged so strong that they endured through decades of separation. Beginning in the crucible of the 18th century, then, and continuing into mature form in the 19th, African American dance in the greater Chesapeake, like a number of other black dance traditions developed contemporaneously elsewhere in the Americas, particularly the Caribbean, came to exemplify something truly new in the history of human culture, a genuine creolization of African and European expressive movement systems. Such a dancing you never see before, Nancy Williams said of the dancing she remembered from her youth in Antebellum, Virginia, and she was correct in ways she herself probably did not recognize. Yet the new dance tradition reframed without obliterating the fundamental Africanity that was the dancer's ancestral heritage. One can more easily identify the European elements in 19th century Greater Chesapeake Black dance: extensive and focal heterosexual partnering, specific dance types, the footwork stylings, and perhaps the postures that sustained them, than the African, because the latter are both more pervasive and more subtle, involving values and processes, improvisation, the centrality of rhythm, dynamic intensity, and competitive individuality, no less than form. What is European has been added without obscuring or diminishing what is African, which persists like the generative rhythm at the dance's core. These, then, are some of the reasons why dancing was so important to enslaved people in the Greater Chesapeake. No other form of creative expression was more important to them or brought them more obvious joy, and so they made it a vehicle of their identity, legacy of the ancestors, and image of the foundational bond of family at a time when any of their families could at any time be torn apart and destroyed. What I've shared with you here does not exhaust the reasons for dance's importance to these dancers. They also danced for the sheer pleasure of dancing. They danced because communal dancing reinforced the bonds of community. They danced because couple dancing was an instrument of courtship. They also danced because no other form of expression so entirely defied slavery's foundation in the appropriation and degradation of the Black body, and because the individual skill and creativity that their dancing demanded, especially in its persistent latitude for improvisation, affirmed the unique personhood that enslavement relentlessly suppressed. They danced, finally, because dancing enacted an African American model of the person that directly contradicted the bodily basis of slavery in the bodies of the enslaved. If these were among the reasons why this tradition of Black dance mattered to those who practiced it, we might still wonder why, as I insist, it commands our attention, even if we are neither historians nor dance scholars ourselves. And the answer to that question requires another story. Dramatic pause. Late in the summer of 2014, I found myself at a wedding celebration in a small town in rural Finland. The American groom, a white man, was the son of a dear friend of mine. The bride was Finnish, as were at least half the numerous guests. I do not recall seeing any Black people in the crowd. Certainly there could not have been more than a very few. Yet when the ceremony was over and a lively dance began that lasted far into the magical twilight of Finland's summer night, everyone in the room, everyone, danced the entire time in ways whose shapes and rhythms were unmistakably derived from African or African American forms. The execution of those forms may have been unimpressive. Their lineage was indisputable. That lineage was also, for reasons I will now explain, a direct inheritance from the enslaved inhabitants of the Greater Chesapeake in the 18th and 19th centuries. How is that possible? And how can we possibly be sure that its obviously African origins lay in the Chesapeake rather than in other parts of the hemisphere where slavery flourished? The answer is that what is now a worldwide way of dancing was spread from the Greater Chesapeake by a forced migration almost as cruel and almost as consequential as the transatlantic slave trade, if far less familiar to non-historians. To sum up briefly, at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries, several developments converged to change the course of American slavery. In the Upper South, decades of tobacco cultivation had exhausted the soil, so white farmers turned instead to the cultivation of less destructive and less labor-intensive crops, such as wheat. In their inhuman economic calculus, they now enslaved and had to feed, house, and clothe more people than they needed to work for them. And divesting themselves of what George Washington called this, quote, species of property, close quote, was an obvious solution. In 1794, Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin, a device that made it possible to process cotton for sale at industrial speed, with concomitant increases in the amount of land and laborers needed to fulfill the promise of undreamed-of profits. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase nearly doubled the size of the nation, offering the vast new lands that could now be devoted to cotton. And in 1808, Congress ended the nation's participation in the transatlantic slave trade, ensuring that the enslaved workforce for the new territories would have to be purchased or transported with their migrating enslavers from the nation's older regions of enslavement. The human suffering attendant on this interstate slave migration was incalculable. Historians estimate, for example, that half these forced migrations permanently severed the victims from their families. And the number of victims was enormous, greatly exceeding the number of Africans brought in slavery to British America. The best estimates are that between 1790 and 1860, more than 1 million people enslaved in the Upper South were forced to migrate to the Deep South. And of these, more than 70% came from the greater Chesapeake. The consequences for dance and other cultural practices could hardly have been surprising. Logically, one might expect choreographic dominance to match demographic dominance, and so it seems to have done. For despite the evidence of a common heritage in the ancient grammar of African dance, geographical isolation must have fostered regional variations in African American dancing by the early 19th century, however fugitive their presence in the historical record. If so, however, such distinctions apparently receded or vanished in the Deep South beneath the weight of Chesapeake migrants' population numbers, as even white people noticed. Quote, "The greater portion of our national poetry originates in Virginia, or among involuntary Virginia emigrants," one white observer declared in 1845, because, quote, "every year thousands are sent to the far South and Southwest for sale. The Virginian type of Negro character therefore has come to prevail throughout the slave states, with the exception of some portions of Louisiana and Florida. Thus, everywhere you may hear much the same songs and tunes and see the same dances, with little variety and no radical difference," close quote. By the time the Great Migration to the industrial North commenced in the early 20th century, the dance tradition born in the greater Chesapeake had become the dance tradition of all African America. It had also begun to overflow the cruel and constrictive channels enforced by racism. From the white vogue for the cakewalk around 1900 to the jazz dance of the 20s, the rock and roll revolution of the 50s, the breaking revolution of the 70s, and all the forms it has generated since, the history of American popular dance for the past century has been a history of the dominance of Black movement tradition. In fact, so deeply encoded in the white body had Black movement styles become by 1930 that the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung could remark on, quote, "the peculiar walk with loose joints or the swinging of the hips so frequently observed in white Americans that comes from the Negro. American music," he added, "draws its main inspiration from the Negro, and so does the dance," close quote. And through the power of American mass media, such as radio, sound recordings, television, movies, and most recently, the tidal force of the internet, the African American vernacular dance tradition has become the world's, an apparently boundless font of creativity and global inspiration, a wellspring of great art first fashioned in relentless suffering, humiliation, and unimaginable loss. It is an astounding achievement of the spirit, unmatched, to the best of my knowledge, in the whole of recorded human history. Those who created it might have claimed as their own the words of the French poet Charles Baudelaire, "Tu m'as donné ta boue, et j'en ai fait de l'or. You gave me your mud, and I turned it into gold." Let us remember them and the art they made. Thank you.
We have microphones in the audience. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, if you're up for some questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, all right.
I don't promise to be able to answer them, but I certainly will try. stunned silence.
You have one over here.
Thank you. Thank you for this. I think this is a question about the white perception of dance, but could you say a few words about, and I think this it certainly relates to the 17th century and the 18th and perhaps into the 19th, your sense of white perceptions of native dance as compared to or as adjacent to African and African American dance?
I wish that there were enough on the record, the surviving record, for me to judge that. I'm sure you're right, and I'm deeply frustrated that we seem to have so little access to that experience. It is certainly true, as I suggested, that in 18th century Virginia, for example, the white elite was dance mad, and some people actually described them in similar terms. I mean, to be a good dancer was to be a fully realized person, and your inner qualities were manifest in your ability to move gracefully and powerfully on the dance floor. That is, in fact, part of why George Washington was such an impressive leader in the minds of his compatriots, because he was an excellent dancer. And in fact, that love of dance persisted even after the evangelical tidal wave of the 19th century. So white people, in other words, in spite of their racism and everything else that lay between them and African Americans, were in a position to be fascinated by black dance. And the numerous accounts of white people watching black dance, although obviously constantly haunted by the prospect of sexual predation, I think was much more than that, because they appreciated it. They knew good dance when they saw it. And in the 18th century, although far less in the 19th, they actually incorporated dances in their own dance practice that they specifically attributed to African Americans. In a way that was not mocking. It was pure enjoyment. These were good dances. They often sort of saved them for the end of the balls, apparently, so that they had a breakdown in Richmond at the end of the major dance events of the year, and were able to cut loose in ways that they had been taught by the people they enslaved, and that they found deeply enjoyable. I don't think that answers your question at all, but if anybody is aware of any evidence of white people from this region in particular in the course of the negotiating the complex and tragic continental encounter between Europeans and Native Americans, if there's any evidence of them noticing and remarking on and recording their response to a Native dance event, I would be very interested to see it. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, first of all, for an interesting presentation. I'm actually one of the new Kluge staff fellows here. So
Congratulations.
Thank you. Following your footsteps, so it's interesting to see sort of this is my first presentation I've been to. It's sort of interesting to see what the sort of culmination of the effort sort of looks like for a topic that's very different from my own. Can you speak a little bit just about the sources for this, because obviously long before the age of video and film and anything, that you could just watch this and see what it's like, and specifically what you found in the library and how you found it, that would tell you anything about this?
It's not needles in a haystack, it's needles in many, many haystacks. The evidence is extraordinarily elusive. There's some on the pictorial record. There is a fair amount of written, if not description, at least allusion to dance. There's no kind of notation. In fact, that hasn't, to the best of my knowledge, existed at all for any kind of dancing, at least in the Western world, until lava notation, which is much too cumbersome, was invented and was soon enough replaced by video. So what I've had to do is comb through letters and diaries and so-called runaway slave advertisements, escaped slave advertisements by the people who claim to own them. And anything to do with movement, anything that mentions movement or mentions dance or mentions music becomes part of a very large file of material that gradually can be a kind of plausible mosaic once I start putting things together. And once I stop being surprised by what I find, there's sort of consistencies across that. So is that helpful? Yeah.
Thanks so much. This is a fascinating presentation. I wanted to ask about the connection between community building and dance. I work on Frederick Douglass, and so I'm struck by the parallel between the way that Douglass would use what he called Sabbath schools, in which enslaved people would covertly teach one another how to read, with like the opening vignette that you applied of like the covert dance that's taking place, the ball, at the beginning of your presentation. And I'm wondering if there's just like both just the general role of dance and community building in enslaved communities in the Chesapeake that you've encountered, and then like more specifically, are these typically dances that would always be covert? Like, would they always have to take place overnight? Was dance banned in the same way that the efforts at literacy were, or were there more public forms of dance?
To answer your second question first, no, they weren't always covert, especially given the enthusiasm of white people for dance. They took it as a matter of course that, of course, everybody loves dance, and if black people want to dance, then under particular and highly controlled and advantageous to themselves circumstances, they were permitted to do so. But of course, black people did not let matters stop there. And so there were covert dances. There are even some surviving rhymes that were probably songs that mock the patrollers for chasing you when you're on your way to the dance. So there was a lot of sanctioned open dancing, and perhaps at least as much, if not more, secret and theoretically unapproved dance. As far as community, I think you're talking about people who were under almost unimaginable stress all the time. And to build a social collective set of relationships that requires trust, that requires some self-disclosure in a way that they would have to trust would not be misused and manipulated, was a tremendous challenge, I think. So dancing, I think, provided a means by which the challenges of community, which was absolutely necessary to psychological and even physical survival, and could be so easily violated in terribly dark and consequential ways by somebody revealing what some of their fellow enslaved people had done to the masters so that they would be punished, for example. I mean, you see that even in the story of the young man in Maryland, because, I mean, he decided that he couldn't handle the punishment, so he didn't like somebody else, presumably in his home plantation community, and so he got the blame put on him. So this is a way of saying that I'm certain, and I have a whole nother section of the dissertation where I talk about the fact that it was an instrument of community, clearly. And the kind of collaborative art making, the personal improvisations that met the same rhythm as was animating everyone else. What an extraordinary metaphor for successful social relationships that is. And I think in that sense, dance imaged social need in yet another way, as it did for men and women dancing together as a couple.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. I was interested when you kind of brought it up to modern day times. You said you were in Finland and you noticed, despite erratic movements, that reflected on the dance from the greater Chesapeake area. So how are you related? And obviously those movements from here came from Africa. So how are you relating the movements from Finland to greater Chesapeake to wherever it could be, probably West Africa? Or is that a too big a leap? Or
yeah, no, that's basically the path. So you would have had people who were caught up in the transatlantic trade from Africa, and there is, as I indicated, persuasive evidence for the existence of a kind of common, fairly ancient, because it was so widespread, understanding of what dance should look and feel and move like across much of Africa. So they weren't starting from very different foundations in their movement imagination. That's what they had to work with when they came together in the New World. And part of what I'm still struggling to figure out is the whole problem of ethnicity. I mean, you find some scholars who say, well, the slave trade was more or less random. By the time the forced migrations had wound their way from deep in the African interior to the coast and maybe traded some people and ended up with a tremendous mix, there was not likely to be much consistent ethnic identification among the people assembled like that. Other scholars disagree. I have to say that there was, a few years ago, was a valiant attempt to make the case that the slaves in the Greater Chesapeake, enslaved people, excuse me, in the Greater Chesapeake, were primarily Igbo in their background, and I don't find it convincing, and I'm not alone in that. Basically, what the author attributed to Igbo practices, cultural practices, were widely found across large areas of Africa, so you really can't say. And the other complicating factor for ethnicity is that white people had no idea what they were talking about, and they would sometimes attach labels to enslaved people's ethnicity that were nuts. So you had people coming from Africa, and if the general consensus, although I'm girding my loins and approaching the Atlantic slave trade database as someone who's not a quantitative historian, I have to handle this. But I don't think, if, as I suspect, it will not disclose the probability that people were in ethnic clumps to a large degree, you would have had to draw on these more ancient commonalities that they might have found in one another's dancing in the Greater Chesapeake. That same commonality would have fostered the dance practices of people throughout the Americas, as we can demonstrate that it did. So you have an African foundation, but not a specific ethnic foundation in a certain type of movement or set of movement expectations and practices. You have it being used to help people sort through the traumatic experience of encountering others who were from nowhere near where they lived originally, and yet finding that they had enough in common that they could begin to dance together. And then you have the second great cataclysm, the internal slave trade, which, again, I can't prove it, but I think the evidence solidly indicates that with 70% coming from one particular area, it was their particular reconstruction of and continuity of African norms that became true for most African Americans in that area. And of course, from then on, we're talking about the Great Migration, and we are talking, as the 20th century went on, with things like jazz dance, things like dance on television, dance in movies, and that, with those vehicles, the dance began to spread throughout the world. And in a way that certainly no other really choreographic art form has. Ballet is widely practiced, but it's a highly rarefied art form. And this was something that ordinary people could aspire to, although they might not be able to aspire to do it well. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
So back to Finland again. What you just said, is that the route through which Finns would have adapted?
I assume so. I mean,
Yeah.
to be honest, I didn't question people on how they learned how to move like that. I assumed that it was similar to what American kids, including white American
Well, my
kids,
guess,
did.
you
They
know,
watched
they
TV, they listened to records, they watched,
Right.
MTV and picked it up and thought they could do it, although they probably would have been considered appallingly deficient by people 300 years before.
Yeah. No, it's just interesting, and I wonder because I've been to Finland a couple of times, and they do have a knack for adopting unlikely things.
Interesting.
Tango is huge in Finland still.
Oh, for heaven's sake, how very interesting.
There was a
yeah.
craze in Europe in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
It kind of, it seems to have never quite gone away in Finland.
Right.
They've got a style of rock and roll of their own called ratalanka.
Oh, that's great.
Which means iron wire.
Yeah. Well, you see, the proliferation continues.
Yeah.
Because if it's rock and roll, it's ultimately rooted in African American cultural
It
practice.
is. It's not to digress too much, but it's just kind of fascinating. What they come up with, because this, on the one hand, they're in the global village, but they're Finland, which it's a very modern place now, but that's a pretty recent development in many areas. Helsinki's always been
and probably with a fairly acute sense of their own distinctiveness, with some very big and very bossy neighbors right along their borders.
Yeah, they have quite a history, and I mean, I think though that it's, and this is just an observation, but I think that because of where they are, they don't worry too much about is someone outside of, what does someone outside of Finland think of this? Right. And like when you're researching Finnish music, it's very hard to find anything written about it that's not in Finnish.
Right. Yeah, and we're missing a lot of Finnish music. I know that, both the folk types and the classical music. There's some, as you probably know, there's some marvelous composers who are barely known in this country.
Wonderful music there.
Yeah. So.
We have time for one more question over here, and then anything we can continue over a wonderful reception. So.
Hi, Jurretta. Wonderful
Hey, Susan,
to see
great
you
to
here.
see
Jurretta and I are
you.
good friends, but just a quick comment.
I wouldn't be here, by the way, if it weren't for Susan and AJ, who had the staff fellowship before me and persuaded me that I ought to try to receive it. So thank you.
On the last discussion, you left out learning how to dance from other people. The way I'm a certain age, in the same generation as you, I learned how to dance rock and roll by showing up at a party when I was 12 years old. I learned how to do the hustle in gym class.
Yeah.
So I think we can't overlook the fact that the white communities have, how did the Beatles know to do rock and roll, right? I mean, so just want to put that in
that's a good point.
It's not just video.
Right. No, of course.
But to go back to my actual question is, so there were a couple of books that I know were very foundational to your work a long time ago when you chose the topic, and I'll mention them because the titles might be interesting to people. One is a book by Michal Sobel called The World They Made Together, and the other one by Reese Isaac is The Transformation. It's The Transformation of Virginia.
Transformation of Virginia.
Transformation of Virginia.
Yeah.
So what both of those had me thinking about, and I wanted to ask you, is one of the things that also changes in Virginia that you didn't mention as much is religion. There's two things that change.
That's one of the things I'm working on.
Religion changes across Virginia, and also African Americans start to adopt more Christianity more widely.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if you could talk about how Christianity does or does not affect the sort of the spread of a cohesive way of music and dance among the community.
It wasn't a problem in the 18th century. White people had a very laid-back form of Christianity to cope with, namely Anglicanism, and African Americans, that wasn't all they had, but that was the dominant religious practice of the elite. And African Americans were not yet the object of conversion encouragement that they began in the 19th century. It's really the change to the influence of evangelical Protestant culture in the 19th century that began to have an effect on something, on all of this. But I know that there are a number of instances where people would become, they'd essentially become Baptist and then they would stop dancing, including African Americans. There were also instances where their enslavers would become evangelical and said, nope, no more dancing, it's evil, you can't do that here. So let's hope they went to the woods and danced anyway. But at the same time, I also have come across a reference among Chesapeake whites from the 19th century that referred to something called Baptist balls. So the old love of dancing died hard and may never have died altogether, because even well into the 19th century, you have a preference for dancing being one of the hallmarks of the sort of stereotypical Virginian. Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.